It worked this time. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Perfect.
Awesome. There we go. Okay, I was a little worried there we're going to have some technical issues.
Yeah, it didn't come through as a call the first few times. This is the first time it actually rang through. So
Really? What was it coming through
yeah,
as?
I don't. It just well, I can't remember now. It was a different screen,
Oh,
and it didn't ring. It made a weird. It made a weird. It was a different ring than my normal ring. I don't know. So
I'm not sure.
anyway, hi.
Hi, yeah.
Thanks you guys for being here.
Well, thanks so much, for providing your writing for us to look at and coming on the show here. I mean, I sort of ask everyone the same kind of questions I like to ask first, like what kind of inspired you to write this story?
Oh, well, it started. I think I started working on it 8 years ago, and there's two
Wow.
plots, two different storylines going on. And the first one is a realtor that's stumbling across a murder in a home that she had sold to a couple that she really enjoyed working with a year earlier. And then I was a realtor at the time, and then later I went back and got my degree in counseling, and then decided to morph the two stories together. So it's a therapist dealing with the psychopath that's stalking her, and then there's another storyline within it where it's a realtor in Michigan that's dealing with a murder mystery. So the two all kind of weave together, and then it turns out to be where they actually end up having something in common. It'll
Wow.
be so it's a very, very complicated storyline, and that's why it's 122,000 words, and I probably still have 30,000 words to write, and I'm
Wow.
going to need to trim down a lot of what I've written to make it all work and still be clear.
So, I mean, I'm always interested when people like relate real life experiences to their writing because it's always going to make it more rich. But it almost makes me wonder now if you've had issues with clients in your work history with between being a realtor and a counselor that is, I mean, that have like inspired you to write this, or it's just sort of a combination of an interesting plot and a little bit of real world
Yeah,
knowledge.
yeah. Well, there are realtors get killed at open houses. That's been on the news, and then therapists have clients that fall in love with them, and that can go awry. So
Wow.
So I'm going to use the two together. And at one point, I thought of keep turning it into two books, but it just loses the whole excitement of it. The two work well together. I just have to figure out how to keep it smaller.
So
So I hope you guys like it and that it seems like I'm on the right track with chapter one. And if down the road you want to do another chapter, I can show one that's the other character too.
that would be really interesting, actually. So okay, so you've been working on this novel for you said 8 years.
No, I actually started it for a contest. It was just a murder mystery contest. So I started to write it, and in 3 days I wrote 8,000 words. And then I thought I would
Wow.
get back to it, and I put it in a drawer. And then I actually had a client who came in to work on a divorce that she was going through, and she had written 3 books. And as soon as she told me about that, and then she told me about NaNoWriMo, I thought, well, she's going to do NaNoWriMo in November. I'm going to do it too. And then I started writing this part.
That's a tough challenge, NaNoWriMo.
Yeah, I did it. I was happy. I did the 50,000
Wow.
words and
Wow, that's
then
amazing. I could never do that. It's too much for me. That's crazy you did that.
oh yeah, I highly suggest it because it does force you. You want to hit the 50,000, so you just write and write and write.
I'm the kind of person that would by day 18 would put a gun in his mouth cuz I get so worked up about word counts. I don't think I could do it, but I've got just like monumental respect for anyone that does because the amount of discipline you would need to stick to a schedule and get 50,000 words written in 30 days is just
Well,
it's
you know, they
incredible.
have, don't they have an April one? We could all do it together. So that could be part of our critique group.
Sounds like a cult suicide. I mean, maybe if people are interested in working together on that, I'm definitely anything that people want to do. We're always open to looking at. But yeah, that's an interesting idea actually. Maybe we will look at doing that. But yeah, Bernadine, if you want to, but thanks for answering those questions. If you want to start reading your story, we'll follow along and we'll dive into discussion.
Okay, all right.
All right, I will mute
Here I
my
go.
microphone and the floor is yours.
Okay, great.
She willed her facial expressions neutral, knowing that microexpressions were more discernible to sociopaths. Psychopaths were said to be born, sociopaths made, created by their environment. How horrible to be made into a sociopath. They spent the majority of their lifespan studying others, mimicking their movements, learning their reactions to social cues, all to prevent detection. They lacked the ability to empathize and were prone to boredom. It was mostly the boredom that forced them out of hiding. Dr. Blair Pennington loosened her tense muscles while sitting the short distance from her patient in the glass box she regretted. She willed her
Oh, shoot.
Are you having some technical issues?
I'm sorry, my phone went out. Do you know where I left off?
You were right. Last thing I heard, her patient in the glass box, she regretted making her office.
Okay, I'm just going to start from there. I don't know. I don't know if it's because I don't have it on air mode or what. Okay, I'll start from there. The first floor suite had windows large enough to be used as an escape route, if not for being hermetically sealed. Her previous office with functional windows inside a vintage home in Laguna's historic shopping district had offered cool breezes and a steady flow of sidewalk traffic. She hadn't expected to miss the sounds of the shoppers or her window blinds rattling in the wind as much as she did, but not as much as she missed the birds chirping at her feeder. She'd taken for granted how the sounds blended together to offset the silent moments when a patient refused to engage. It was usually her court-ordered patients or those forced to attend by a spouse on the verge of divorce who lasted the longest in silence. Today, though, it was her who caused the lag in conversation. I just told you I broke into my sister's home and killed her dog, and you didn't even flinch, Dr. Pennington. Are you going to say something? I'm listening, she said in a neutral tone. This happened years ago. What triggered the memory? Are you feeling sick? He asked. Your voice sounds shaky. I'm fine, she said, wondering at what point that phrase had become a lie. Her patient was calm, his words thoughtful, and it didn't matter how well she matched his tone and demeanor or how well she masked her concerns. He knew that he'd struck a nerve. He spoke of details matching the recent crime against her as though he'd read the police report or her private journal, or the worst likely scenario, had committed the crime. He showed a sense of entitlement, a history of violence and sexual aggression, but since this was common among her caseload, she had ignored the red flags and chalked her indifference up to habituation, the process of becoming complacent after a history of working with violent offenders. His motives were still unclear unless it was simply to watch her unravel in front of him as she put the pieces together. It was better to appear oblivious while she gauged the severity of the situation. But what she really wanted to do was ask him why. Why her, and when had she become a target? Was it when they had first met, two strangers bumping into each other in a crowd, then laughing to soften the awkwardness? Or was it weeks later when he sat across from her for the first time? He hadn't acknowledged the brief encounter during the intake session, so she assumed he hadn't remembered her. It wasn't smart to make assumptions. As their working relationship progressed, she hadn't noted an increase in symptoms or behavioral changes. Nothing alerted her to take precautions. She wouldn't fall apart in front of him, not only because of her training, but because dysfunction was her native origin. How unraveled could she become when, as far back as she could remember, danger was her norm and safety the exception? Her childhood was a mixture of lessons on avoidance. She learned to overlook the obvious offenses and pretended to idolize the people she both loathed and feared. She knew better than to agitate anyone who could overpower her. So her childhood was at least good for something. It groomed her for appearing calm under the worst of circumstances. Her best option was to bore him, cause him to lose interest. If he couldn't spike fear within her, if he couldn't bring her to a state of trembling and watch her trip over her words, possibly cry or beg him to leave her alone, he would move on and make someone else his project. Something about her had piqued his curiosity, but what was his plan? Whatever it was, he was taking it to the next level by revealing himself. He remained patient while they sat in silence and while she reflected on her earliest memories of him. He'd been charming and thoughtful, attractive, someone who put effort into his personal appearance. Now sitting across from the same man, well-mannered, impeccably dressed and manicured, she found him to be grotesque. His pronounced muscles and protruding chest no longer suggested a commitment to healthy living, but a threat against her well-being. "You don't seem fine," he said. "You're never quiet. What's bothering you? Is it your marriage?" He flaunted his knowledge of her failed relationship, but she didn't object. Years of rage hovered just below the surface, and if he looked closely enough, he could probably see the wires of her memories banding together and sharing data in an attempt to diffuse the situation. She was the unfaltering host of a time bomb that should have detonated long ago, but Blair never exploded. She never cried or screamed, and if she complained, it was only to Sam, her colleague and friend, the one person she fully trusted. Her lack of neediness, she later learned, was the perfect elixir for those lacking empathy. She was attractive to the wrong people, but only in her personal life, until today. "Maybe it's my confusion you're sensing," she finally said. "One minute you're discussing your career, then confessing to a brutal crime, only to move on to asking about my marriage." Blair waited a moment to let it sink in. "Let's start with your confession. What made you angry enough to kill your sister's dog?" "There she is," he said. He smiled, and for a moment her body relaxed in response to the positive stimuli. He liked when she took control, but there was no refuting who held the power. He could harm her at any moment, and no one could help her. She raised her brow, a cue that she expected an answer. "Some people are more affected by an animal being harmed than a person. I guess I'm just trying to figure out what type you are," he said. Silently, she counted to 10 and monitored her breathing. "How is this important?" she asked while pressing her thumb into an acupressure point on the palm of her other hand. The air conditioning was acting up again. Her back felt damp against her leather chair, and she wanted to remove her jacket, but doing so would remove a layer of protection. It was now his turn to keep her waiting. Blair checked the time, finding the clock to be at a standstill. Possibly the humidity was causing mechanical damage. She subtly glanced at her wristwatch, only to find the devices were in sync. She hadn't moved in a while, and her foot had fallen asleep. As she repositioned herself, the chafing of fabric scratched against the silence like a needle being dragged along vinyl. "I have another confession," he said, rubbing his hands down his thighs while leaning back in his chair. "My sister never had a dog. She's too selfish. You, though, I pegged for an animal lover." "What? No response?" "If you had a dog, what would you name him?" He would have read the half-worn letters off the tag on his collar. At some point, her patient had leaned back in, shrinking the space between them. She'd missed her cue to mirror his movements. The simple technique of sharing postures and gestures increased their ability to bond and facilitated empathy. This, she realized, was a lost cause when working with someone unable to empathize. Most days, her mirroring was as seamless as a murmuration of starlings, diving and swooping without collision. The birds were brilliant in how they flew in tight formation, deterring predators by appearing like one larger bird. But Blair had no one to form with, so her only defense was to run down the clock and wait for her next patient to enter the building. She didn't want to think about what would happen if he didn't show for his appointment. "Are you aware that you smile when you speak of hurting or killing?" she asked. He stared at her in that casual way, the way a cat would while lounging between pounces on a cornered mouse. She heard the air conditioning attempting to kick on, sounding more like a gasp, as though the room agreed with her new assessment of him. "My question first. You must have mentioned having a lab. Why else would I think up such a thing?" He'd given her too many clues for her to continue on in ignorance. But if she voiced her suspicions, what would he do? Would he admit what he'd done and engage in an honest conversation? Maybe tell her he wasn't through with her? Or would he become incredulous and storm out? "We've never discussed my personal life," she said. "Do you feel any remorse over what you've done?" He dug his fingers into his thighs, then moved them to the arms of his chair as though getting ready to stand. "I didn't do anything. I already told you that." It had been a week since her home invasion. The police approximated the time of entry to be 9 o'clock in the evening based on a neighbor seeing lights on at that time. He would have left their weekly session and driven directly to her home. Nothing seemed to have been stolen, and only a few things were knocked over or broken. An officer found a knife in the utility room not far from where she found Oliver, her black Labrador, sitting crouched and cowering, body pressed into a corner, panting, whimpering, and only slightly wagging his tail. Oliver looked relieved to see her, but also as if he wondered how she could leave him scared and alone for so long. What would any other woman do if she were alone in a building in the business district, which mostly shut down at 5, with the man who broke into her home, terrorized her dog, and was now making a game of it? She wanted so badly to scream at her patient, call him a psycho for making her home into a place where she would forever wonder what he touched or used, and if he'd walked around freely as though he were a welcomed guest with no worry of being discovered. How curious would he have been to rummage through her belongings, trying to gain a more intimate understanding of how she lived. If she continued down this line of thinking, she would imagine all the things he planned to do to her. She couldn't let herself go there. Her patient removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, revealing deep puncture wounds. It hurt her heart to think of Oliver needing to fight back, although it was good if he'd left evidence. She wondered if he'd meant to reveal the gouges or if the heat had him making a mistake. Blair looked at the clock again, relieved to see the second hand now resting near the 12. She would soon be free of him and could call the police. He bent over, placing his elbows on his knees as he ran his fingers through his hair. "I don't like how you're handling things today," he exclaimed. The lounging between pounces had ended. "And that fucking clock, you look at it like you can't wait for our time to be up, like you don't want me here," he said. Then he noticed a loose seam on the arm of his chair. He pulled at the thread. "Do you want me here?" Nothing she said would go over well. She hoped her next patient was early, that the panel on her wall by the door would light up red, indicating his arrival. He pulled harder on the thread till it came free. She glanced at the light panel on the wall, realizing how this too might agitate him, then noticed a small amount of blood on his index finger. She forged a smile. "I didn't know my keeping track of the time bothered you," she said. "You were right, though, when you mentioned me not seeming myself today. It's just a headache, but maybe we should wrap up for the day, pick up next week." He constricted the leather armrests, leaving a smear of blood behind. His arms shook slightly as he looked around the room, narrowing his focus on the clock as he rose and walked towards it. Then he picked it up. "I knew you seemed off," he said. "You don't need to pretend with me." She nodded, feigning appreciation just as the light on her wall turned red. She steadied herself as she rose, knowing her path to the door would bring her closer to him. He let her walk by, but as her hand touched the handle, she felt a slight breeze as the sounds of metal and glass crashed against oak. She ignored the damage, her body as stiff as the door itself as she crossed the threshold. She was in the common area of the suite, the lobby just 30 feet away where her next patient sat listening to the sounds of ocean waves. Her patient stared at her, his body a statue, so calm and still, nothing suggesting he recently committed vandalism. Maybe he'd expected her to offer a grander response. "These walls are paper thin. I'm sure my next client is wondering about the noise." He put his suit coat on, making his way towards her and standing close enough for the fabric of their jackets to touch. She breathed in deeply, catching the faint scent of his cologne. Blair stepped back, clearing the path while motioning him towards the exit. He complied, although stopped short of the lobby to glance her way. "See you next week," he said.
Thank you so much for reading that, Bernadine. You did a wonderful job.
Thank you.
Per usual, I'll end the call now. We'll open up the live discussion on the piece, and then afterwards, if there's anything you want to add, final comments or anything like that, more than happy to bring you back on the call and we can end it that way. Okay?
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're very, very welcome. Okay. So let's just take a look at, I'm just going to bring up Bernadine's, what she wanted us to focus on here. There's got to be a way for me to make this a little bigger. Well, here, let me just hear. Okay, so the first thing, the overall impression of the writing, whether there's enough tension being built. If not, where did I miss the mark? Let's just focus on that. So Bernadine is asking about tension, if she's successful in building tension, and if not, where could she improve upon? Personally, I actually think she did a pretty good job building tension. I think that some areas could use improvement, but on, overall, I was interested to see where this was going to end up. And I don't always feel that way when I read, newer writers' work. It's not like it's uninteresting to read, but I don't feel super, I don't know. I don't have like a burning question in my head to really know where things wind up. I'm just kind of enjoying the ride. So in that regard, I thought it was pretty successful. And I'll talk a little bit about why I think it was successful. I mean, you've set up a woman in an office with a man who we learn his more than likely, or pretty well, definitely, broken into her home. She's nervous that he's going to hurt her. And we don't know if he will. So the way I felt reading it is that, she kept kind of turning up the heat until the end. He gets violent and then he leaves. And definitely as a reader getting to that ending, I really did wonder what was going to happen. Knowing that it was a thriller, I thought maybe he would take her like a hostage or something, abduct her. Which, the way that it did end, makes me wonder. I mean, we know she's going to call the police. I do wonder what's going to happen to this guy. Are they going to catch him, and then, how does that engage the plot, or did the cops not know where the man is, and that's sort of where the tension is being built, is he could be anywhere, the police can't find him, and she's just sort of dealing with that. What did people think? Did you feel that? Did you feel that tension in the writing the way I did, or did you just not really sort of get those questions burning in your head? And just while you're answering, the one thing that I think does sort of hurt the tension, the flow, there's a lot of exposition, particularly in between moments of dialogue. There's one particular moment where it really hurt the dialogue. Let's see here. Why is that not? Oh. So, some people are more affected by an animal being harmed than a person. I guess I'm trying to figure out what type you are, he said. How is that important, she asked. Now, after the character asks this question, there is a lot of text. And then he brings up something completely different. And then she says, what? No response. The first time I read that, I had no idea what the hell she was talking about. And the reason that, on paper, I guess there's not that much distance, but there's quite a lot of ideas separating the two. Because all of this is always going to distract from the last line of dialogue. If you're setting up a question that needs that next answer, unless this is, building on the question itself, so it's still at the front of the reader's mind, it's really going to dull down the flow of the writing. There was another part too where I thought it kind of had the same effect, where it destroyed the flow of the conversation. Shoot, where is it? Oh, okay, yeah, it's more near the beginning. So she says, "I'm fine," and then all the way we kind of get an answer. Now this one works a little bit better because this can act on its own, right? Someone doesn't need to say "I'm fine" for us to understand what he's saying here, that you don't seem fine. He could just say that to her as a person. You don't seem fine. It doesn't really matter what was said before. So it's a little bit better, but I just think it throws off the flow of that back and forth, right? It just kind of disappears because of all the exposition in between. Okay, something else I want to talk about. Sentence structure. She willed her facial expression neutral, knowing that microexpressions were more discernible. Dr. Blair Pennington loosened her tense muscles while sitting the short distance from a patient in the glass box. She regretted making her office. No, that one's okay. She hadn't expected to miss the sounds of the shoppers of her window blinds rattling in the wind as much as she did, but not as much as she missed the birds. Today, though, it was her who caused the lagging conversation. Her patient was calm, his words thoughtful, and it didn't matter. He showed a sense of entitlement, a history of violence and sexual aggression. So the majority of paragraphs are beginning with, these comma spliced sentences. I just think it helps the writing to have variation in sentence structure, specifically that first line of a paragraph, because the first line of a paragraph is a pretty important line. It's not as important as the first line of a book, but I think we've all been in a position before where we're reading and we get to a paragraph that we know is not really that important to the plot, and we kind of just gloss over it and we get to the next one, especially if there's dialogue afterwards, because that's where the story's going to keep going. So you got to make sure you're keeping readers on the edge of their seats. I mean, I talk about this sometimes as, in regards to plot. You want an exciting plot, but you also want exciting words, exciting sentences, exciting paragraphs. Philip says, I thought they were in some kind of secure institution at first, a bit reminiscent of Agent Sterling and Hannibal Lecter. It's funny you say that. I was actually going to bring this up. I did get a Hannibal Lecter vibe from this. It really made me think about the sort of conversation that would go on between, I can never remember the detective's name. I'm assuming it's Agent Starling. And then, speaking with Hannibal, when they're in that prison and they're talking through the glass, the way he just sort of says these borderline insane things that just kind of veer away from what, that more straight thinking character is trying to, they're trying to get to the bottom of something, but he's just drifting all over the place and using these obscure metaphors. And anyway, I wonder if you had that. Well, I mean, clearly you had that impression of it. So I did too. Probably by the end of the first page, I started to get a Hannibal vibe. Philip. So I assume there would be guards on hand if things got out of hand. Yeah. They're a little vague with the description. Dr. Blair Pennington loosened her tense muscles while sitting the short distance from a patient in the glass box. She regretted making her office. I didn't really know what that meant. In the glass box, she regretted making her office. I didn't know if that was a metaphor or a euphemism or something. But then it was like the first floor suite had windows large enough to use as an escape route. So then I was like, well, wait, is there just like a ton of windows that it's like a glass box? Like it threw me off. So I didn't really know how to visualize the room. Which is something like in my writing, like I've mentioned before, like I'm a minimalist writer. A lot of things I don't describe because I don't think it matters. The reader can just describe or imagine it how they want to. So in a case like this, like until this was described, like I just kind of had my own mental image of the office where they were speaking, especially after this where I didn't really know what to think. I just wound up kind of having my own idea anyway. So I just think that the descriptions need to be a little bit more literal, maybe is what I'm saying. Bernadine, so would you delete all of that exposition completely, or is it useful enough to use elsewhere? If I'm being totally 100% honest, when I read this chapter, it reads like a first draft. And it's good, to be honest. Like, this is not a completed novel. You're still writing it. And when you write a first draft, you write a lot more than you need to because you're figuring things out for yourself. There's a lot of description, what I would typically call, telling instead of showing, especially with how the protagonist is feeling. A lot of the backstory about them running into each other. see, like if I was writing this personally, like I would not tell this much about it. Like I don't think in this moment it matters. Right? Like it's important for you to know as the writer because you're trying to figure out the story. And when you're writing it, you're going to include a lot of detail. But once you get to the editing process and you're trying to cut down to make the best story that reads the best for your audience, I think a lot of this is going to be taken out. So eventually the exposition, I think you'll find yourself that you're going to just kind of cut it out. But as it stands right now, it just looks like a first draft. So I wouldn't say there's mistakes here. I'd say that this is just part of the writing process. Jamal says, I really like the writing. Bernadine has some good descriptions and figurative language. I agree. The story initially reminded me of the relationship between Tony Soprano and Dr. Melfi, his therapist. I never watched The Sopranos, but I thought there was a lot of telling, not enough showing. I already kind of mentioned that. There was also a lot of description of action that was slowing down the pace without really serving much function. I kind of agree with that. We'll get into that more. I think some of the inner monologues and general character action should be cut. Just kind of talked about that. Also, the character's inner thoughts and the narrator's voice was oftentimes mixed up together that made it hard to follow along these parts. That's a good point, Jamal. Also, do we want the reader to know right away that the man is guilty of breaking into the therapist's house? Is that a plot point that could be leveraged to create more tension? I actually felt that us knowing that he was the criminal. Knowing he's the criminal definitely builds tension. We need to know that. I don't know if we need to know as much detail as is currently in the story, but I think it's really interesting having this story that this woman is realizing who this man is while she's alone with him in a room in this sort of doctor-client relationship. Like, I actually think that's a really great literary technique for this chapter to build up that tension. And, you know, as I say all the time, you know, drip feeding information through this chapter is really important to build that tension. It depends on what Bernadine has planned for the rest of the novel. There also were some redundancies in the description, but I think a revision will cut a lot of that as well. Yeah, there were some redundancies. I mean, there's a few spots where I thought that things could be untangled, just cleaned up a bit, but it's a first draft. Bernadine, I love that you saw Anything Soprano, Melfi. I really gotta watch that show. Yeah, Jamal makes a lot of really good points. I want to touch on him talking about the character's inner thoughts and the narrator's voice were oftentimes mixed up together, and I felt that too when I read this. Let's see if I wrote down any specific moments, but that's why I say that I think a lot of the writing, a lot of the exposition that's in the chapter as it stands right now, it feels like half of it is relevant to like what will actually be in the final version of the story, and the other half being like just Bernadine figuring out things as she's going along through the story, just writing things down. So it feels like those moments where she's working things out on the page is where the confusion begins, because it's those moments that feel like they belong to the story, that seem like ideas that really more so belong to the therapist character. Bernadine, this is chapter 1. The following chapter starts 9 weeks earlier. She has more than one character fitting this patient description, so the reader will wonder for a while who the stalker is. I wonder if that's a mistake. Because I gotta say, Bernadine, one of the things about this chapter that I was most impressed with was the really aggressive sort of approach to plot. Like, you just dive right in, and you used like a good scene, I thought, that allows us to start figuring out these characters. And to me, like, it felt like this is going to be like the villain, this man that she's dealing with. And it's nice to have like a face-to-face with these two characters right at the first chapter. Because if you jump back 9 weeks and we don't know, like right now, as a reader, I just want to know what happens next. I want to know what happens between her and this guy. He just smashed a clock in front of her. She's so terrified she hardly even flinched at it. He's wiping blood on the chair. You know, they're having this really intense sort of nothing being said aloud sort of moment where she knows that he broke into her house. So that's why I talk about like the questions that you create for your readers, right? If you jump back 9 weeks and you drift away from what you've just built up, I think you're going to lose attention. Because I don't care about anything that happened before at this point. I just want to know what happens next. I like I already said, I was already having questions like, you know, is she going to call the cops? Are they going to get this guy? Is he going to go on the run? Is she going to be taken hostage? Like, what's going to happen between these two characters now that she knows who he is and he knows who she is, right? Like, there's no question of motives. It's just a question of where things head next. I think that might be worth thinking about. Philip. Her backstory can be introduced slowly, though, to use Clarice Starling as an example again, her childhood backstory with the Silence of the Lambs isn't revealed until way later in the movie. Yeah, and again, I think, I really feel that that's just, again, like what I talk about, drip feeding information. It's okay to have a couple cards held to the chest. You don't need to put everything on the table right away. And it's more interesting to learn the past as we progress to the future. There's just, I mean, as it stands right now, I think there's a little bit too much information in this first chapter. And I think that, well, like, so the whole image of this guy picking at this like thread in the chair is really interesting. I mean, it's a pretty literal metaphor, but I thought it worked really well. And when I was reading through it, like I knew that there, like I said, there was too much exposition, and I was kind of like thinking to myself, like, what can I tell Bernadine to sort of to help with this? And once I read that bit with the thread, I was like, she already has the answer. Like, you need to, that again, like that's showing instead of telling. I mean, this insane person just picking at the thread of a chair with blood on his hands. I mean, I don't even think if you need the blood. I don't know where the blood really came from. I never was really certain about that. But this guy just picking at the thread of it. I mean, who goes to some doctor's office, sitting there looking in the face and just picking apart the chair, like just looking at them? Like that's just insane. So I thought that worked really well, and it started making me like wonder. I wonder what the therapist is physically doing while she's sitting there talking to this guy. I mean, there's some discussion about, you know, her muscles like relaxing and things like that, but you know, is she fidgety when she's nervous? You know, does she go very still? Does she sweat? You know, does she breathe heavy? You know, does she have anxiety? You know, these are the kinds of questions that I wonder about her, like as a character, as a believable person in your story. That I think as the author, it's important to know. Just today, like for some of my writing, I got a piece of loose leaf and I put my characters' names on the page, and I just started writing out adjectives, everything I knew about the character, everything I could just relay right there on the spot. And I think it might be worthwhile for you, Bernadine, to do that with this character, to maybe figure out what she's doing physically while this moment is playing out, that again builds that tension that you want from your audience, right? There's things that she could be doing that clearly show that she's very, very worried, very upset, dreading what's going to happen. That makes sense. I like the thread imagery too. Yeah, that was Philip who said that. Jamal, I thought that was great showing as well. Yeah. See, so the thread was really good actually. Just that sort of unhinged, falling apart at the seams kind of, it's a very little expression of like his mind. It just worked really well, and it was very brief too. You only talk about it for a couple paragraphs, and just a few lines within them that are specifically focused. I think there's only 2 or 3 lines that really talk about the thread. Jamal, you can use dialogue to also reveal that the therapist showing nervousness. Yeah. Okay. I kind of like the robotic dialogue from the therapist because she is a trained professional, and it feels a little bit like a game of chess, the way these two are talking to one another, and I think that builds on the tension. I will admit, a few moments, the dialogue felt a little bit stilted. So, like the very first line here, I mean I would say that's a pretty big info dump. I just told you I broke into my sister's home and killed her dog, and you didn't even flinch, Dr. Pennington. Are you going to say something? I don't think anyone would say that. It just seems like the first line in the story, trying to educate the reader on where they stand. Like theoretically, it's good. Like I just told you something horrific and you didn't even move. Like, are you gonna do something? Or like, I get that intention, but like for one thing, I was thinking about this, Dr. Pennington. If you have like a friend, I don't think you ever really say their name when you're talking to them. If I said, "How you doing today?" you say, "Pretty good." But if I said, "How you doing today, Bernadine?" It feels like I don't know you as well as I did like the first time I asked. And I feel like with this character, I think a sociopath would, though, if he's taunting her, he'd want to be very specific. What do other people think? Maybe it's the voice of the character. Jamal says, in real life, you would typically say a friend's name when you're trying to emphasize something. Yeah, I do agree with that. Bernadine says, he'd want to hurt her by saying it again. I have clients who use my name a lot and many that don't. Definitely depends on the person. Well, okay, all right. But it's indisputable that when I read this line, it felt stilted. It didn't come off to me as a strong first line. Like, because there's other ways to allude to them having a disturbing conversation, or I mean, am I the only person that read that line and felt that it was off, or is it just me that felt that way? Because that's the thing, when you're you have a different mindset when you're reading for the sake of critiquing and when you're reading for the sake of reading. Like you're going to be a little bit more analytical when you're critiquing, you're looking for opportunities to improve. So maybe I was being a little bit oversensitive. Jamal, I really like the intention of that line. It initially pulled me in because of how jarring it came across. Okay, so Jamal liked that line. He wants her to know that he broke into her house and hurt her dog. Right. Okay. All right. Fair enough. Okay. I can concede on that. Let's just see what else Bernadine asked us to look at. So to just, to answer the question, impression of the writing, whether there's enough tension being built, if not, where did I miss the mark? I would say that you were pretty successful in building tension, actually. You created a lot of questions for the reader, a lot of interest. It's just some of that, we'll just say a little bit of overwriting, disrupted the flow a bit. Not everything needs to be written out, but I think the hardest part of writing was done successfully in this. Everything else can just be fixed with editing. Does the story flow? I think we kind of already, well, at least you guys let me know. You can put in the chat what you thought. Personally, I mean, I've kind of already given my answer to that. I thought the flow was a little bit dragged out just because of how much writing is there in comparison to how much is actually going on. Like the home invasion, like I'm not sure we need quite that much detail. Like we want to know what happened with the dog because like everybody's got a soft spot for a dog anyway, and it was a nice image, the dog sort of being terrified. But I think that most people will read that and think like, ugh, like someone like this insane in my house when I'm not home breaking in. Like there's enough level of like empathy with the character and self-reflection that a lot of what the writing's trying to like, the sort of impression it's trying to give off, it's just unnecessary because sometimes the reader can do some of the work in a way that it doesn't really feel like it. It's just by being human, we're doing part of the work of the story. I just think that's one of those cases. Is any part confusing? I mean, some a little bit of the description that I kind of already talked about, like that moment with the glass box she regretted making her office. I don't think there was really anything else, like from description point of view, that was confusing. I agree, though, that line could be edited. It comes across as a bit jumbled. Are you talking about the first line of dialogue? Or are you talking about the glass house or glass office that I was talking about? One thing I'll mention, just because I like the dog part, like in a sadistic way, I guess. I just thought it was a good bit of description. I would get rid of all the end of it. I think you're softening the blow by adding this sort of like wagging at the end and sort of like this feeling of relief. You don't want the reader to feel any relief through this whole chapter. Just food for thought. Were there any parts that other people found confusing? Would you get rid of the startling murmuration line or the needle being dragged along vinyl, or are they interesting? The murmuration. Let me just check that line again. Most days her mirroring was as seamless as a murmuration of starlings diving and swooping without collision. I kind of like the imagery of it. I'm not... A murmuration. Maybe I don't really know what that word means. Google. Let's get the exact definition here. The phenomenon that results when hundreds, sometimes thousands of starlings fly in swooping, intricately coordinated patterns through the sky. Ah, that's a cool image. Wow, look at that. Oh, don't do that. I mean, honestly, now that I'm seeing it in front of me, it becomes very, very cool. But I didn't know exactly what it was. Oops. So, I mean, I would never cut a line because somebody is a little bit ignorant on what you're talking about. You know, Hemingway always said to write like everybody knows what you're talking about, everyone knows. So, I'm okay with that line. And I like the needle being drug across vinyl line too, actually. It's like a nice little spin on like, cause like everybody talks like nails on a chalkboard. Like I would always call that like a cliche, but like a needle across vinyl, it's more I don't know. It's like a nice spin on that sort of idea. So I was actually a fan of that line. Watch videos of murmurations. It's breathtaking. I'm just curious if you like it though. Yeah, I like it. Oh, let me see here. I love that description imagery, but I would change drug to dragged. I think that's the more appropriate verb there. That is... Oops. The recognized and correct past tense form of the verb drag is dragged. Drug can still sometimes be heard, but only in certain dialects within the United States. Sometimes a group of people have a way of speaking that's particular to them. So that might actually be part of Bernadette's dialect. Potentially. But it appears that, you know, English grammar would determine. But I think that one's up to Bernadine. That's a good call, though. That's a good catch. I didn't even pick up on that at all. Were there any parts that others found confusing specifically? I think it was Jamal that said that sometimes the flip between the protagonist sort of ideas and more narration could be a bit confusing. I do agree with that. Sorry if it was Philip that said that. I can't remember which one of you said that. That was a good point though. Sometimes the flipping back and forth was a little bit confusing, but again, that just falls more into the category of the overwriting. But it'll come out in the editing. Bernadine says, Jamal's probably right. I had it as dragged, but it didn't feel right. Poor grammar sometimes feels more right. Lol. Yeah, I agree. Sometimes you get so used to saying something that you want to write it the same way, but people are not... People don't often speak with good grammar, so you kind of have to correct yourself. But I also feel that art is... it's a reflection of one's life, one's emotions, one's experiences. And if you want to write the way that you speak, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. But it's good to know if you're doing something that's, maybe breaking some of the English language rules. To me, she is the narrator since it's only ever her thoughts and opinions that are being written about. I thought there was two protagonists, though. Is there not? The realtor and this character? Because if these characters ever meet, that's going to get confusing. I think it's, again, like, the interpretation of a story is always going to be a little bit different when you're reading for the sake of critiquing. So when I read some of the lines, like, it just feels very much like yourself, you're the writer part of your brain just at work and just throwing everything down on the page to, to get that story, formed for yourself so that you understand it best. So that inevitably when you get to that, that stage of editing and cleaning up and rearranging and, preparing it for a real audience experience, you're going to know what's going on and how much to say and what you don't need to say and all that. When I have it edited, I'll write dragged for her to help me decide. The two characters never meet. Okay. It's up to you, Bernadine. It's however you want to approach the narration. It would be interesting if you ever want to send some, like you said, like maybe another chapter of the other character. It would be interesting to compare the way the narration is written in comparison to the two characters. It almost makes me wonder if you are approaching the actual writing in a different sort of style or voice as it pertains to each character. Because if you're trying to mimic their thought process, two characters are probably going to think differently. But anyway, it'd be interesting. There's a lot of, Bernadine speaking, there's a lot of info in chapter 1 that is understood within the first 3 chapters. You mean like that the reader will learn? Almost all the book, other than chapter 1, is more dialogue than exposition. Okay. I think that's common for a first chapter. First chapters are so hard to get right. They're so hard. So, if I wrote a first chapter, there'd be quite a lot of exposition in it as well. Because, that's what you want to do in a first draft, is just get everything on the page, figure out as much as you can, learn as much as you can about your story, about your characters, so that when you start getting to 3rd, 4th, 5th drafts, editing processes, you'll know what you need to cut, what you need to leave in, all that stuff. So, does chapter 1 seem more like a prologue? Well, no, it didn't read like a prologue at all. I thought that it was going to be linear. I thought it was just going to go straight into the next chapter, as far as like what happens after this moment. To be honest, I'm a little disappointed. I don't have your other chapters in front of me. Maybe they're really, really terrific and really interesting and it works well, but I'm not a fan of hooks. I do not like hooks in books. Dr. Seuss over here. I don't like hooks just because it feels very businessy. It feels very artificial. Personally, this is a subjective opinion. Does not reflect the way everyone feels. Every writer is going to have a different approach to writing. They're going to have different rules for themselves. So don't take like what I'm saying as necessarily a criticism. It's just the way I feel. But I just think that a hook only serves to create artificial interest. Ooh, that's so cool. But then it doesn't even matter in the plot as far as what's happening in the linear fashion. Some books, the timeline jumps around. And that's a different situation. But if you're writing a linear book and you just have that first chapter as just there to clinch your reader, to create interest, publishers love it. Agents love it. You'll have a better... the first book I ever wrote, I had a hook in it. And it got my foot in the door with a publisher when I was 18 years old. And I actually got to talk to them about my book, because most would not even answer, or they just say no thanks, we're good, and move on. But that hook actually got the attention of a publisher from the UK. But I think it just I don't know. I think it's almost a cliche in itself. No, I don't think chapter 1 is more of a prologue. I thought this was a good first attempt at a chapter 1. Yeah, that's the way I thought too. I thought it was a really terrific way, like it's just a great first step into this story. Because it explains, I felt like I know I said that there's a bit of overwriting, but I don't think that there was like, how do I explain? Like there was like necessarily like too much backstory as far as like what do we know? He broke into her house. She's his therapist. She knows and he knows. Like they're both on the same page as to what happened, what each other's intentions are. He knows she wants to get the fuck out of there, and she knows that he wants to do something awful. And even though it's not being said outright, like I think that's all we need to know as a reader to make us interested in this situation, because we want to know what's going to happen. The stakes have been raised. And that's why I like the idea of this being the first chapter in a linear fashion, because it gives you a really great platform to start your book here and let that backstory trickle in. We don't really know who the hell these people are. All we know is that she is in danger, and we don't know what he's going to do because he's clearly insane. And she keeps telling us that he's insane. He's a sociopath. He's trying to mimic his actions, trying to keep it cool. It's like I said, it's like they're playing this game of chess with each other. That's really interesting. That works really well within the thriller genre. This is all like I said, I don't know what is going to happen in your the next chapters, but this felt like the right first step in a linear story as far as creating a really great thriller. Personal opinion, though. Philip, what did you think about this as a hook? I mean, how do you feel about hooks? Do you think this story benefits with this hook, drifting back a bit into the next chapter and building things up? Or did you find that this was, a good first step? And just while you're answering, let's just take a peek at... Does it seem realistic how she's handling the session? I mean, I'm not a therapist, so I'm sort of at the mercy of the information to be educated on how a therapist would approach this situation. And that's why, your experience within this field, Bernadine, is going to enrich the writing, because you know how to act and how not to act, and how, God, I hope you've never been in this situation, but I'm sure that, within your field, you're trained to be prepared for an issue like this. I mean, your whole job is built around working with mentally ill patients. So, every doctor's got to be prepared for this in one way or another. So, yeah, it's up to you in how you let us know how a therapist should behave. Like I said, some of the dialogue felt a little bit stilted. That's the only thing that detracts from the realism, I guess. Bernadine, I've had mild stalking and know they don't really train us on this. Really? I would think that that's something that they would have to. Because mentally ill people, things can go wrong. And a lot of mentally ill, I just think a lot of that broods out of abandonment issues, childhood issues. It's usually derived from relationships that have gone awry. It's not always just, I was born this way and you know what I mean? A lot of it has to do with relationships and upbringing and things like that. So I would just think that you would be prepared, because people are still people. It doesn't matter what setting you put them in. They're still going to have human reactions to things. Anyway, I'm just surprised at that. Philip, I liked it. I was initially confused over the setting. Like I said, I thought at first she was in a secure hospital or somewhere. Okay. Yeah. First chapters and getting the hook right is definitely a hard thing to do well. It is. It is hard. And that's why I was impressed with this. I mean, Philip, do you think that it should be left as a hook? Or do you think that there's still potential in drifting back like into the next chapters? Bernadine, you would think, and many of us work on our own. She was pressured into changing offices and immediately learned it was a mistake. She was pressured into changing offices. Okay, I definitely didn't get that from the story. I didn't know she was pressured into changing offices. Maybe we're not supposed to know that yet. Sorry, just 2 seconds. I gotta blow my nose. Bernadine, she used to work in a facility with other therapists. Not supposed to know that yet. Bernadine, I appreciate all your comments. It's definitely giving me a better perspective. If there's anything you would say to just throw out, I'd love to hear it. It's a long first chapter. So that's the thing. Like, it's not that I read this and felt that there was like whole paragraphs that should just get thrown out the window. It wasn't that sort of impression. It was, like I said, it's just that stage of writing that I recognized immediately of just, just figuring out the story. I'm just trying to see if there's any like particular line that I There's no like specific line that I really wrote down. I guess one. This really isn't even that big of a deal, to be honest. But there's like one line of dialogue that I felt compelled to just jot down that I thought was particularly just sort of awkwardly written here. I didn't really find that a believable way of speaking. I didn't know my keeping track of the time bothered you, she said. personal opinion. What was the question? Let me just double check the question. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting. Does it seem realistic how she's handling the session? So we've kind of answered that. I mean, the answer is we're sort of at the mercy of your information. We don't know what a realistic handling of the situation is, because we've never been in that situation where we're not. I mean, even if they don't train you, at least to some degree, you know what's going on in their head, I guess. I don't know. Maybe that's not really fair to say. But I still think that we're sort of at your mercy because we don't know. Oh, did you? I rewrote that specific sentence on Saturday. It was originally, I didn't know that the clock bothered you. Yeah, maybe the way you had it before was better. But again, this does sort of like, because it's determinant on how much information is between two ideas. So he's talking about the clock. You look at it like you can't wait for our time to be up. Like, you don't want me here. You know, do you want me here? And then she answers a question that was answered before. I mean, it might be something that someone would say in real life, but I think within the context of a story, I mean, you could do it this way, but you might want to move this stuff so that it's just closer, so that people aren't going to forget. But I didn't read that line and forget necessarily what was going on. But if you wrote it the other way, I don't know. But I do think that it's important just to know how much information is between two moments of dialogue if you want them to, you know, connect to one another. Minus the word that. I changed it because it's not really the clock that bothered her. It was her watching it that bothered him. Yeah, and that, like, that, I didn't have an issue with, like, the context of what she was saying. Yeah, it was just the way it was written. I thought maybe it could be cleaned up a little bit. I thought maybe she could say something like it's my job to keep track of the time when we're here, something like that. Like that felt like something that maybe a doctor would say to sort of diffuse something. Like, it's my job to know what time it is. But that I didn't put a whole lot of thought into a solution, to be honest. I don't like to, like, offer big solutions to things like that. Like, I don't want to. You're the writer. I mean, you want your story to be told your way. I don't want to impede on that. I just thought that there might be a better way to do it. Too much space between dialogue. I'll work on that one. And her having a headache. Huh? Like, you want her to have a headache during the... I wonder if she would even have a headache. Because she's probably in a state of shock. When you're in shock, I don't think you feel pain. Because I'm assuming she's just realizing in this moment that he is the individual that has broken into her house. Otherwise, why would she let her into the office in the first place? So if you're just realizing it there, like, I think you're going to be, in some degree, in a state of shock. You're going to have that fight or flight reaction. Oh, the sentence where she says she has a headache. Okay. Right here, I have a pounding headache. I don't know. I didn't know my keeping track of the time bothered you, she said. You were when you mentioned... Okay, so you want to probably... You were when you mentioned me not seeming myself today. That probably needs to be cleaned up too. Oops. I have a pounding headache. Maybe we should wrap up since we're close to time anyway. That feels very believable. Maybe it's the slang. Wrap up, close to time. Those all things, like, sounds like things a therapist would say. You were right when you mentioned. Oh, you're saying that's missing? You were right when you mentioned me not seeing myself. Oh. Okay. Still a little tangled, but I can see. Okay, that makes a lot more sense though. I just the believability of the dialogue is just really, really important, I think, especially in this context of this chapter where, you know, these two characters sort of just with what's going on between them. I didn't know my keeping track of the time bothered you, she said. You were right when you mentioned me not seeming myself today. I have a pounding headache. Maybe we should wrap up since we're close to time anyway. I think it might be worthwhile investing some time into thinking how these two characters would really speak. It's harder to determine like flatness in dialogue when it's like a high stakes situation, especially with the crazy dude, because you can't really say he's flat, because like there is dimension to his character. He is saying interesting things as far as like a reader following along the story. I just think you should just invest some time in just sitting down and just really thinking about who these people are, you know, the sorts of things that they do even outside of the story. That's why I always talk about those little exercises about taking our characters and putting them in random situations that don't even really necessarily pertain to the novel or the story you're working on. Just you know, how does this guy react when he's in line for the grocery store or I don't know, at the beach? Like just little things like that you could just write in a page just to see how they react and what they do and test their limits in certain situations. It just helps you get closer to them and write them more believably, because you'll have a better relationship with the character. Okay, so the last thing here, what are the better parts and what are the worst? Well, I think it's like the different levels of the chapter that, and I would never say the worst. I'd say maybe some areas that can be improved on, but there's nothing here that's a disaster. I would say the best part is like the execution of a first chapter. Personally, I think that this is a great way to approach a first chapter of a thriller. I thought you were successful in building that tension. The part that I think that needs the most attention would probably be that overuse of exposition, the overwriting. I would give some time to, you know, considering dialogue. Not even that, like I thought that the flow of dialogue was pretty good as far as how these characters are interacting with one another. It's just the things that they're actually saying could be worked on a little bit, and like we were saying, like the distance between certain things that are said, where, you know, there's too much information in between the lines of dialogue that it is disrupting the flow. To like you'd have to like look back and be like, what did they say again? Oh yeah, that, and that's how that relates. Like you never ever 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 want a reader to have to look at a line twice. Never. That is like my golden rule of writing, and I think it's a good rule to have. You should have to only read a line once to understand it, Now, double meanings and things like deeper meanings, like that's a different story. But as far as I had to read a line twice to kind of like figure out what the writer was trying to say or the author was trying to say, that needs to always be fixed. It should always be a priority. Clarity is key. So, what do you guys think, Philip, Jamal? I mean, what did you think was the best execution of the story, and what part do you think requires a bit of improvement? I mean, Philip says I agree. Maybe you just agree with what I said, but maybe Jamal, do you have an opinion? And Bernadine, was there any last questions you had for us? Any final remarks? Or Philip, I would say tighten up the descriptions a little and integrate some of the exposition-y stuff a little more throughout. Yeah, okay. Yep, I would agree. Throughout the book, that is not just the first chapter. Yeah. When you say tighten up the descriptions, Philip, what do you mean by that? Like, are you saying like clean up the way they're written, like from a grammatical standpoint, or are you saying like make them more literal? Just wondering, can you expand on that just a little bit? Both you and Philip pretty much summed up my thoughts. Okay. All right. Well, I mean, I definitely enjoyed reading it. There's no question about that. I like that too. I feel like the quality of the writing has been increasing the longer we do this. Like Philip's story was really great. Nova's story, I mean, there were some issues with the plot, but there was a lot in that actually worked well too, I thought. And then this one here, like this really feels like a first chapter, which is always going to be impressive to me because I really struggle with first chapters. I always struggle to know like when, like what part of the story is really the appropriate time that you give the biggest opportunity to, start that humble beginning for the story, but also, start the action and keep it as interesting as possible. So I have a lot of respect for this chapter. Was there any last things, Bernadine? Sorry, I gotta blow my nose just one more time. I'm a mess tonight. Bernadine, this was very helpful. At whatever point, I would love for you to look at chapter 2 and see if it's too far of a drop in tension to keep the interest. Yeah, you can. I mean, send it along, Bernadine. Worst case scenario, we don't get to it right away, right? I mean, it can still sit in the inbox, though. But right now, as it stands, there's no other stories to critique. So I would love it if you sent the next chapter if you're comfortable with doing that. Philip, I could not quite picture the setting, but once that is in place, it will work well, I think. Jamal, once you figure out the characters. I think all three of you are a tiny group of 4. It is our tiny group of 4. What can you do? I mean, there's got to be other people down the road that will become attached the way that we are, that are committed to the writing. It has to be. We're not the only. Like, a lot of people want to write and want to take it seriously. That's why I'm wondering if the Reddit group will help find the right people. Because I didn't really advertise on Facebook a whole lot, aside from that like one big post I made like in that writer group. So we'll just have to see. Jamal, voices, I think it will also reduce the overwriting. Oh, I see. So once you figure out the characters' voices, I think it will also produce the overwriting. I agree. I completely agree. And I also think, like, once the book is done and you have the whole plot in front of you, like, you don't need to repeat descriptions. Bernadine already mentioned that a lot of the information that's in the first chapter, we find out over the next few chapters anyway. So she already knows that there's redundancies there. Because, like I said, the only thing we need to know is that this guy broke into her house and she is scared, but she's trying to keep it, like I said, that sort of chess gamey approach. Let's just get through this, get me the hell out of here. And but as the reader, not knowing what's going to happen, they're just alone. Anything could happen. This guy could just snap any moment. Jamal, I can't wait to read chapter 2. Yeah, I'd actually really like to read chapter 2. It would be cool if, unless somebody else sends something that we haven't read before, it would be cool to read that for Thursday and go over it and have like both chapters kind of fresh in our minds back to back. Like I said, I mean, I always want people, like everyone who's in the group, to have an opportunity to send. I will always prioritize, someone's, first story that we critique over someone resubmitting another piece. But if nothing else comes in, I'm more than happy to read over Bernadine's. Bernadine, thanks. Blair isn't being herself in this chapter because she's thrown by learning he's stalking her, so she's showing up as one-dimensional. Yeah, she's definitely going to be in that state of like shock, that fear. That's why I was saying, like, maybe think about what she's doing physically. What are her hands doing? What is she sweating? Is she, stuff like that. Like, how does she appear when she's very, very nervous and very scared, or in this moment? And that might help build that tension without having to rely on all this exposition. Any last thoughts? Chapter 2 is less polished, so there will be way more to critique. Well, you could do like we did just here, though, right? I mean, you could just give us some things that you want, or we could use the same questions again, just to focus on. We don't have to focus on things like grammar and polish. We could just look at it from a pure standpoint of plot and where we think that the story's headed. She's more dimensional in chapter 2. She doesn't show any expression, or he would pick up on our attention. Yeah, we can definitely look at the characters, but I'll be honest, like as a reader, I'm most interested in plot. I genuinely want to know. Philip, definitely the makings of a good thriller novel. Completely agree. Really agree, actually. I feel like a lot of people, I feel like if I tried to write a thriller novel, I wouldn't be able to do it as well as it's been done here. Just being honest. Brittany says, thank you. Yeah. I mean, I've said everything I have to say, I think, more or less. Let me just one more quick check of my notes here. If anyone else has anything else to say, now is the time, or forever hold your peace. Maybe I'll just end this on, just really quickly, just a few lines that really stood out to me that I liked. Just really quickly. Here. Wondering at what point that phrase had become a lie. I thought that was great. The red flags and chalked up a different situation. I thought that was great. Right here. I thought this line was really great because for just 1 second, I felt like I knew how a woman felt, to be honest. I've never read anything before that genuinely, just even for just a second, put me into the real mindset of a woman, which I'm surprised I didn't bring it up earlier, but his pronounced muscles and protruding chest no longer suggested a commitment to healthy living, but a threat against her well-being. And I guess it's just such an interesting approach to like physical appearance. Like, you think that a woman looks at a guy who's well built and it's just like, look how good looking he is. You know what I mean? Like, you think that that's just like such an attractive quality, but then now it's become like a threat. And a man will never feel that way, right? Like, and you look at an attractive woman, the attractive nature of a woman is never going to turn into a threat. A man could never feel that, or at least, a heterosexual man could never feel that way. So I just thought that was a really interesting line. It genuinely made me feel something. This line too. She was attractive to the wrong people. I didn't like the end of it. I thought it dulled down what was being said, but she was attractive to the wrong people. I thought that was excellent. And then, yeah, the other thing was like the thread. I put quite a few check marks over the thread part because I just love that image of the guy pulling the thread. But anyway, I just wanted to end that on a positive note. There were parts of that I really, really enjoyed. That were done really, really well, especially for like a genre piece. These sorts of approaches to language are sometimes ignored within a genre writing because they're just focused on the plot and that, like you're saying, the tension building. But like this line especially was just, I thought that was fantastic. So congratulations, Bernadine. You did a great job on this first chapter. We're all excited to see where the story heads next. Everybody seems to be on the same page. Okay. All right, guys. I'm going to wrap this up. Bernadine, if you want to email me the second chapter, you're more than welcome to. If you want to polish it up a bit before you send it, you're more than welcome to do that as well. It's totally up to you. Regardless, I will put up posting on the Facebook group that we need more writing. We'll see if anybody sends anything in. We're going to meet on Sunday about the Hemingway book. So we're reading the first, I think it was 48 pages of A Farewell to Arms. We're just going to talk about it. It's going to be pretty relaxed. Just shoot the shit. Any questions, or are we all pretty good? And Bernadine, do you want me to do a line edit on this? Because I can if you want me to. I don't mind doing that. I can do it tomorrow morning and then I can email it to you. Check the group real quick here. Yeah, only 18 people. Brittany, I'd love it if you have time. Yep, I can do that for you. No problem. Everyone else, I'm assuming everyone else is good. If any questions come up, like I always say, you could message me through the group or you can email me at thewritingaroundfb@gmail.com. But until the next time, keep writing, and I look forward to meeting again. Everyone have a good night.